The record was 12 seconds long. That was what unsettled archivalist Ben Sor first, not the content, not the silence that followed, but the length. 12 seconds of audio captured by the Conclave's deep-range atmospheric sensors on the day the human delegation left Threshold Station. 12 seconds in which every human aboard said nothing, touched nothing, broke nothing. They simply walked to their ships, and the bay doors closed behind them. Then Sora had reviewed the file 43 times across 6 planetary cycles, and each time she finished, she felt the same thing she could not name in any language she knew, a cold pressure behind the eyes, like standing at the edge of something that had no visible bottom. The humans had not protested, had not threatened, had not even looked back. That was the part she couldn't explain. Every sentient species Vensora had ever studied left some behavioral signal when they were defeated. Aggression, submission, grief, performance of indifference. The humans had displayed none of these. They had walked with the measured, unhurried pace of a species that had somewhere else to be. 3 questions had lived inside her since that day. What had the humans actually wanted from the Conclave? Why had they agreed to leave without a single condition? And why, in the 12 seconds of that recording, did not one of them look at the station they were leaving, except for the last one through the door, a woman named Elena Vasquez, who stopped for exactly 2 seconds, stared at the wall of the bay rather than the exit, and then continued walking. Not the door, the wall. Vensora had spent 4 cycles trying to understand what was on that wall. There was nothing on that wall. There was nothing on that wall. The Conclave had not expected the humans to request a seat at all. That was the honest truth, buried in 17 layers of diplomatic language in the original briefing. The species from the 3rd planet of a yellow dwarf star in Sector 7 Marginal had no military assets that registered on standard threat matrices, no colonial reach beyond 2 adjacent moons, and an internal political structure so fractured that 3 separate delegations had arrived claiming to represent the same species. The Conclave had granted them provisional observer status largely because denial required paperwork and because Arbiter Collective member Dresh Tolan had found humans, in his recorded words, agreeably non-threatening. Elena Vasquez had been one of those 3 delegations. She was not the most senior. She was not the loudest. She was a xenolinguist from a mid-tier Earth institution who had spent 11 years learning to speak 4 Conclave languages without a translator implant, which every other species considered either charming or slightly unnerving depending on their neurological relationship with patients. Then Sora had pulled Vasquez's personnel record after reviewing the departure footage for the 12th time. The record was unremarkable until you noticed the edge cases. Vasquez had requested, during the 18 months of pre-summit negotiations, a total of 47 information transfers from Conclave public archives, standard materials, historical records, species behavioral databases, trade route documentation going back 2,000 years. No one had flagged it. Why would they? Observers requested information constantly. It was practically their entire function. But Vensora was an archivalist. She knew what 47 requests looked like as a browsing pattern, and she knew what 47 requests looked like as a map. Elena Vasquez had not been reading. She had been building something. The requests followed a logic that only became visible when you laid them end to end. A sequence of questions about every major systemic failure in Conclave history, every famine mismanagement, every supply chain collapse, every diplomatic overextension that had left a member species isolated and unsupported for decades at a time, every wound the Conclave had ever quietly let close over without healing. Vasquez had read them all. And then she had walked out of the station without looking back. The summit itself had lasted 9 days. Vensora reviewed the transcripts obsessively, now with different eyes, and what she found made her set her work aside and stare at the ceiling of her archive chamber for a long time. The humans had not asked for anything unreasonable. That was the misinterpretation the Conclave had made first. When the three delegations had finally unified their position, a process that took 4 days and apparently involved a great deal of shouting in a closed room which the conclave members had watched through observation glass with the particular discomfort of people witnessing a species apparently self-destruct in real time, the unified proposal was modest. Structured trade access, shared navigation data for 2 established routes, medical exchange protocol. Observer voting rights on matters directly affecting Sector 7. Dresch-Tolan had called it the proposal of a species that does not understand what it is asking for. He hadn't been wrong, technically. The humans didn't have the infrastructure to take full advantage of any of it. Not yet. The conclave had rejected the proposal anyway, not out of malice. Sora wanted to be honest about that, even now, even in the private notes she was keeping that no one else would read. They had rejected it out of something quieter and more insidious than malice. They had rejected it because humans were small, and the conclave was large, and the mathematics of priority had simply never moved the human file to the top of any list. We will revisit when your development indices support greater integration, Dresch-Tolan had said. And Elena Vasquez had looked at him for a moment with an expression that the conclave's behavioral analysis software had tagged as neutral acceptance. Sora had pulled that footage too. She had frozen the frame. She had looked at Vasquez's face for a long time. That was not neutral acceptance. She didn't have a word for what it actually was. It was something a human would probably recognize immediately. It was the expression of someone who had just confirmed something they had hoped was wrong. The first sign that something had changed came 11 months after the departure. Not dramatically, that was what made it so easy to miss. A shipping consortium in Sector 12 reported difficulty renewing a navigational licensing agreement with their usual human-adjacent broker, minor, administrative, the kind of friction that generated one paragraph in a quarterly report. Then Sora noticed it because she was looking for exactly this kind of thing now, though she couldn't have explained why to anyone's satisfaction, including her own. You filed 17 cross-sector monitoring requests in the last 2 cycles, her departmental supervisor said, standing in the doorway of her archive chamber. What are you looking for? I'm not sure yet, Sora said. That's not how resource allocation works. No, she agreed. It isn't. He left. She kept looking. By the 14th month, the pattern was undeniable. To anyone who was looking at all 17 reports simultaneously, which no one else was, human-adjacent commercial relationships were quietly restructuring, not withdrawing. Restructuring, contracts renewed under different terms, referrals redirecting to different intermediaries. Shipping schedules shifting by small margins that were individually meaningless but collectively described a slow, careful tilting of weight. The humans were not retaliating. There was nothing to point at and call retaliation. They were simply making different choices in the thousands of small daily transactions that held galactic commerce together like biological tissue. Choices that had been available to them all along, that they had simply not exercised before. Then Sora thought about the 47 archive requests, about every wound the conclave had let close without healing, about a xenolinguist who had spent 11 years learning to listen in languages that weren't hers. She thought Elena Vasquez did not walk out of that station in defeat. She thought she walked out knowing exactly which threads to pull. The cold pressure behind her eyes returned, sharper now. In the 18th month, the conclave received a formal communication from the Ureth Combine, a mid-tier but strategically critical economic partner in Sector 9. The Combine wished to expand its human sector trading relationship and was requesting conclave assistance in navigating the relevant protocols. Dresch-Tolan had forwarded it to a subcommittee with a note calling it a peripheral matter. Then Sora had obtained a copy of the original Combine message through channels that were technically within her archival authorization and practically not the kind of thing her supervisor would enjoy knowing about. She read it 3 times. The Combine wasn't asking for help navigating protocols. That was the polite framing. What the Combine was actually communicating in the layered diplomatic language that Conclave members use when they wanted to say something without being on record saying it was that humans had already begun offering the Combine something the Conclave had not. Not technology, not military protection, not resources, knowledge. Specifically, the humans had provided the Urith Combine with a detailed analysis of 3 recurring supply chain failure points in the Combine's Eastern distribution network, failures the Combine had been absorbing as normal operational losses for 60 years. The human analysis identified root causes no Combine economist had found and proposed restructuring approaches that, in preliminary modeling, eliminated 63% of those losses for free. No contract, no negotiation, no formal exchange mechanism. A human trade liaison had simply sent the analysis in a standard communication, attached to an introduction letter, and waited. Then Sora set the document down. She thought about 11 years of language study, about 47 archive requests, about every systemic failure in Conclave history, every supply chain collapse, every wound left unhealed. Oh, she thought, that's what she was building. It wasn't a map of Conclave weaknesses. It was a map of everyone the Conclave had failed to adequately serve. And Elena Vasquez had spent 18 months of pre-summit negotiations identifying every one of them, learning their problems and preparing solutions, not as leverage but as introductions, as the first thing you say to someone you intend to know for a very long time. The humans hadn't come to the Conclave to join it. They had come to find out who else might want an alternative. Dresh Tolan convened an emergency session in the 22nd month. Then Sora was not invited. She obtained the transcript anyway, within 6 hours, through means she was becoming increasingly comfortable not documenting. This is manageable, said Dresh Tolan. They have no enforcement mechanism, no fleet presence, no colonial authority. What they are describing is an informal economic network with no legal standing under Conclave Charter. The Urith Combine has restructured 2 trade agreements, said another member, whose name Ven Sora didn't recognize, a newer appointment. The Pelhari sovereignty has opened formal dialogue with the Human Trade Office on Kepler Station. The MOVA Collective sent a delegation. Dialogue is not defection. The MOVA Collective sent a delegation, the member repeated, and this time the weight of it apparently landed because there was a pause in the transcript. The MOVA Collective had not sent a delegation anywhere in 40 years. They were, by any standard metric, one of the Conclave's most isolated and poorly integrated members, resource-rich, perpetually underserved, and in possession of navigational rights over the corridor of the Shan that every major shipping faction wanted and no one had successfully negotiated for in living memory. Humans had apparently had a conversation with them. What did they offer the MOVA? Dresh Tolan asked. No one in the transcript answered because no one knew. That was the moment Ven Sora understood the second thing she had been missing. The humans hadn't just mapped the Conclave's failures. They hadn't just prepared solutions in advance. They had done something far more unsettling in its simplicity. They had listened to species that the Conclave had long since stopped listening to, and those species remembered what it felt like to be heard. She found Elena Vasquez through a public speaking registry, a conference on Kepler Station, open attendance, no diplomatic restrictions. She registered under her archival credentials, which was legitimate. She told herself this was professional research, which was partially true. Vasquez was shorter than her visual record suggested. She stood at the front of a mid-sized conference room with the relaxed stillness of someone who had spent a long time learning not to fill silence with noise. "You came a long way," Vasquez said, before Ven Sora had introduced herself. Her Conclave standard was unaccented in ways that weren't possible without an implant, except Vasquez didn't have an implant. Archivalist designation, Ven Sora, yes? You know who I am. You've been pulling records for 10 months. You're very careful about it, but archival requests have signatures. Vasquez's expression was not unkind. You figured it out. The Conclave rejected you, Vensora said, and you had already planned for that. We hoped they wouldn't, Vasquez said. We genuinely hoped. She paused, and something moved across her face. Not performance, not calculation, something that looked like a loss she had decided to keep. But we spent 18 months in pre-summit negotiations learning everything we could about who the Conclave had failed to take care of. Because if the Conclave said yes, we needed to understand the ecosystem we were joining. And if they said no, you already knew who else needed what you had. We knew who else deserved to be asked. Vensora was quiet for a moment. Around them, the conference room filled slowly with other attendees, species she recognized from Conclave peripheral registries, exactly the kind of species whose quarterly reports generated one paragraph. The Mova Collective, she said. The Corridor of Ashane. Vasquez said nothing, which was its own answer. The Conclave will classify this as a hostile reorganization. They'll move to isolate the network. I know, Vasquez said simply. You're not afraid of that. It wasn't the question. Vasquez looked at her steadily, and Vensora had the sudden vertiginous feeling of having asked the wrong thing. Not because Vasquez was hiding anything, but because the honest answer was stranger and older than anything Vensora had a framework for. We've been building things from nothing for 100,000 years, Vasquez said. We're not fast. We're not the most powerful species in any room. We make enormous mistakes and we argue constantly, and we are very, very bad at agreeing on anything. She almost smiled. But we don't stop. That's the thing the Conclave's behavioral models don't account for. They assessed our threat level based on what we had. They never asked how long we've been willing to work towards something we didn't have yet. The Conclave's isolation measures arrived 6 weeks later. They were comprehensive. They were well designed. They should have worked. They assumed the human network was a negotiating structure, that it had a center that could be pressured, a leadership that could be threatened, a set of interests that could be satisfied in exchange for compliance. It had none of these things. What it had was 400 individual relationships, each one built personally, each one grounded in a specific problem solved, a specific need acknowledged, a specific promise kept without being asked. You could not isolate a structure that wasn't built like a structure. You could not threaten a center that wasn't there. Every attempt to apply pressure at one point redistributed quietly to 100 others, and the network absorbed it the way living tissue absorbs impact, not by being hard, but by being continuous. Dresh Tolan's emergency communique to the Human Trade Office was, Vensora later learned, answered within 4 hours. Vasquez had written the response herself. It was 11 words. We're happy to discuss terms whenever the Conclave is ready to listen. It cost them. Vensora needed to be honest about that too, in her private record of these events, that was becoming something larger than she'd intended. 32 human trade liaisons were detained at Conclave-controlled transit stations over a period of 4 months. Supply interruptions hit Kepler Station hard in the winter cycle. Food scarcity, medical supply delays, 3 deaths that appeared in no official report but that Vensora found in a human memorial register that was publicly accessible to anyone who looked. They kept working. Not because they didn't feel it. Vensora had seen enough human behavioral data now to know better than that. They kept working because someone had made a calculation, or not even a calculation, something older than calculation, that the distance between where they were and where they needed to be was crossable, that the cost of crossing it was real and would be paid by real people, and that this was still the right direction. She didn't have a word for it in any language she knew. She suspected humans did. The Mova Collective opened the Corridor of Ashane in the 31st month, not to the Conclave, not to humans exclusively, to a cooperative navigation framework jointly administered with access provisions weighted toward species that had been functionally excluded from the corridor for decades. The legal architecture was airtight. It had been drafted over 14 months by 7 human legal scholars working in consultation with Mova, Urith, Pelhari, and 4 other species whose names appeared rarely in conclave minutes. Dreshtalan called it illegal. 3 independent arbitration bodies ruled it wasn't. He called it a provocation. Vasquez's office sent a brief, polite clarification, noting that the framework was open to conclave participation on the same terms as any other party, should the conclave wish to apply. Then Sora submitted her formal analysis to the conclave archives in the 33rd month. It was 600 pages long, and it would not make her popular. It began with a 12-second audio file and ended with a question she did not answer because she did not believe it was her place to answer it. The question was, what do you do with the species that treated rejection as a research opportunity? She thought about Elena Vasquez standing in the conference room on Kepler Station, about the way she described her species, not with pride, not with defiance, but with the matter-of-fact steadiness of someone describing a physical law. We don't stop. Then Sora thought about the wall in the departure bay, the wall Vasquez had looked at for 2 seconds before walking away. She had spent over a year wondering what was on it, and she finally knew because she'd requested the original architectural schematic. There was a systems integration panel on that wall. Behind it ran the primary environmental and communications infrastructure for the entire station. Vasquez hadn't been saying goodbye to the conclave or mourning the outcome of the summit. She had been looking at the work that would need to be done, the literal bones of the system that would need to change, and she had spent exactly 2 seconds doing it, and then she had walked toward the future she was already building. The conclave had watched her leave and called it surrender. And somewhere in the years between that moment and this one, in the thousands of conversations held in rooms the conclave hadn't been invited into, in the problems solved and promises kept, and losses absorbed and mornings that came after nights that should have ended everything, somewhere in all of that, the galaxy had quietly, irrevocably shifted. Not because humans were the strongest force in it, because they were the only ones who had never, not once, believed that strength was the point.